They told them Americans would treat them like animals, and by the time the truck stopped under the Texas sun, some of them had already started to believe it. The heat pressed down like a weight, dry and endless, dust lifting in slow clouds as 8 women stepped off the back, their movements uneven, measured not by choice but by the short length of chain between their ankles, metal brushing dirt with every step. A sound that carried farther than it should have in the open air. Elsa Hartmann kept her eyes forward, not out of discipline anymore but because looking up required something she no longer had, and around her the ranch spread wide, acres of pale grass and fence lines stretching to a horizon that didn't seem real, men standing there in worn boots and hats, silent, watching, not hostile, not welcoming, just present. The women lined up as instructed, shoulders squared out of habit, though the war that had taught them that posture was already over, and the silence that followed felt longer than it was, broken only by wind moving through dry grass and the faint shift of leather as one of the cowboys adjusted his stance. Jack McKenna stood a few yards away, older than the others, his hat pulled low against the glare, his hands still, his eyes moving not across the group but down, settling on the ground where metal met dust, where each step left a shallow drag mark like something being pulled instead of someone walking. He didn't speak, not yet, and no one else did either. As if the moment hadn't decided what it was supposed to be, Elsa shifted her weight slightly, the chain tightening, a small involuntary motion that drew her breath in sharper than she intended, and she froze again, waiting, because waiting had become the safest thing to do. Somewhere behind her, a gate creaked open, the sound slow and familiar, ordinary in any other place, but here it carried through the stillness like a signal, and one of the men glanced toward it, then back. Jack took a single step forward, boots pressing into the dry ground, the sound soft but clear, and he stopped again, closer now, close enough to see details most would ignore, the faint redness around Elsa's ankle, the way the skin had worn thin where metal had rested too long. The way she held herself as if any movement might be corrected. He removed his gloves, one finger at a time, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, and the leather creaked quietly as he pulled them free, tucking them into his back pocket. Still no one spoke, the air holding its breath with them, the sun climbing higher, casting sharper lines, and for a moment it seemed like nothing would happen at all, like this would remain just another arrival, another routine, another day measured in tasks and distance. Elsa finally lifted her eyes, just slightly, not enough to meet anyone's gaze, just enough to see boots in front of her, worn leather, dust-covered, steady, and she waited for an order she could follow, something predictable, something that would not require her to think beyond the next step. Instead, Jack looked down at the chain again, then back up, his expression unchanged, and when he spoke, his voice was even, almost quiet against the open land, but it carried clearly, cutting through the stillness without force, as if it belonged there all along. Take them off. No one moved at first, not because they did not understand the words, but because they did not trust them, and the silence that followed stretched thin under the Texas sun, long enough for doubt to settle back into place. Elsa felt it immediately, that instinct to stay still, to wait for correction, because orders were often followed by something else, something unseen, and her breath slowed as if preparing for it, but nothing came, only the sound of wind moving across open land and the faint creak of leather as one of the cowboys shifted his weight again. Jack did not repeat himself, he did not raise his voice, he simply stood there, looking at the chain as if it did not belong, as if it had been left there by mistake, and that quiet certainty began to move through the space between them. One of the guards hesitated, keys in hand, glancing once toward Jack, then toward the others, as if searching for contradiction. But there was none, only that same steady presence, and finally he stepped forward, boots pressing into the dust, each step sounding louder now that everyone was listening. The first lock clicked open with a sharp metallic snap that echoed more than it should have, and Elsa felt the shift before she understood it, the slight release at her ankle, the absence of tension she had grown used to, and for a moment she did not move, because her body did not recognize the feeling. The chain slipped free and dropped to the ground, a short fall, but the sound carried, clear and final, and something in the air changed with it, subtle but undeniable, like a line being erased. Around her, more locks opened, one after another, each click followed by the same brief silence, the same pause where nothing else happened, no correction, no command, just the steady rhythm of metal being removed. Elsa lowered her gaze, watching as the last piece of chain fell away from her feet, lying there in the dust as if it had never been part of her at all, and she drew in a breath that felt different, deeper, not because the air had changed, but because she had space to take it. She shifted her weight carefully, expecting resistance, expecting the pull that had defined every step since her capture, but there was none, only the ground beneath her boots, firm and still, and she took one step forward, slow, uncertain, her body adjusting to a movement it had almost forgotten. No one stopped her, no one corrected her, and that absence was louder than any order could have been. She lifted her head then, just enough to meet Jack's eyes for the first time, and what she found there was not approval, not expectation, just acknowledgement, quiet and steady, as if he had done nothing more. Then restore something that should have never been taken. Behind her, one of the other women let out a breath she had been holding, the sound small but human, and another shifted her stance, testing the same freedom, each movement tentative at first, then more certain. The men did not react, did not comment, they simply watched, and then, almost without signal, one of them turned toward the open field, gesturing with a brief nod. Not an order, just a direction. Elsa followed the motion with her eyes, then stepped again, this time without hesitation, and the difference was not in the distance she covered, but in the way she stood, shoulders no longer braced against something unseen, her balance her own. The chains remained on the ground behind them, scattered and still, catching the sunlight in small, dull flashes, and no one moved to pick them up right away, as if leaving them there mattered, as if the moment needed proof that it had happened at all. They did not speak as they walked, not because they were told to be silent, but because silence was the only thing that still made sense, and the open field ahead of them felt wider than anything Elsa had ever known, stretching out under a sky that seemed too large, too indifferent to what had just happened. The ground was uneven, dry in patches, soft in others, and each step she took carried a new awareness, the absence of weight at her ankles, the absence of sound that had once followed every movement, and it unsettled her more than the chain ever had. Behind her, the others followed, their steps quiet, measured, as if they were still listening for something that might call them back, but nothing did, only the wind moving through tall grass and the distant creak of wood from a fence line shifting in the heat. One of the cowboys walked ahead, not turning to check them, not counting them, just moving at a steady pace that they began to match without being told, and that was new, too. The idea that they could choose to follow rather than be forced. Elsa glanced down once, just to be sure, half expecting to see the chain still there, some mistake in her senses, but there was nothing, only her boots, dust-covered, moving freely across the land. Her breathing settled into a rhythm she did not recognize at first, slower, deeper, not driven by anticipation or restraint, but by something closer to balance. They reached a section of fence where tools had been laid out, simple things, worn handles, metal edges dulled by use, and the man ahead stopped, gesturing briefly toward the ground, not an order, not a command, just an indication of what needed to be done. No one translated, no one explained, but the meaning was clear enough, and one by one, the women stepped forward, picking up tools with hands that hesitated only for a moment before remembering how to work. Elsa wrapped her fingers around a wooden handle, feeling the roughness against her skin, solid, real. Something that responded to effort instead of restricting it, and she adjusted her grip, testing the weight, the balance, small movements that belonged to her alone. The work began without announcement, a quiet agreement forming in the space between them, each person finding a rhythm, bending, lifting, aligning, the sounds of labor replacing the sounds that had defined their arrival. No one hurried them, no one corrected them sharply, and when a mistake was made, it was met with a gesture, a demonstration. Not a reprimand, and that, more than anything, unsettled Elsa in a different way, because she did not know how to measure herself without fear. Time moved differently there, not marked by orders or signals, but by the position of the sun, the gradual shift of light across the field, and at some point she realized she had stopped thinking about the past few minutes, the chains, the moment they fell, and had begun to focus only on what was in front of her, the line she was aligning, the post she was steadying, the small, precise actions that built something. Instead of restraining it, she straightened slowly, pressing a hand against her lower back, and looked across the field, seeing the others moving in the same quiet rhythm, their postures changing, shoulders less rigid, movements less guarded, as if something invisible had loosened in all of them at once. She turned her head then, just slightly, and saw Jack standing near the edge of the field, not overseeing, not directing, just there, his hands resting at his sides, watching in the same calm way he had before, and for a moment she wondered if he expected anything in return, some acknowledgement, some sign that what he had done mattered, but he did not move, did not speak, and when their eyes met again, it was brief, almost accidental, and then he looked away, as if the moment had already passed, as if what mattered now was not what had been removed, but what they would choose to do without it. The sun climbed higher, and with it the heat settled deeper into the ground, pressing against their backs, slowing their movements, but no one stopped, not because they were ordered to continue, but because stopping no longer felt like the only option they had. Elsa adjusted her grip again, the wood of the handle warm now from both the air and her hands, and she worked with a steadiness that surprised her, each motion becoming more certain, more deliberate, as if her body was remembering something older than fear, something quieter. A breeze moved across the field, brief but noticeable, lifting loose strands of hair and carrying the dry scent of earth, and for a moment it cooled the space between breaths, enough for her to notice how her shoulders had lowered without her realizing it. Nearby, one of the women hesitated with a fence post, unsure of its alignment, and a cowboy stepped closer, not abrupt, not imposing, simply reaching out to adjust the angle with a small, practiced motion, then stepping back again without a word, leaving the correction behind like something shared rather than enforced. Elsa watched that exchange out of the corner of her eye, not turning fully, not drawing attention, but storing it somewhere she could not yet name. The rhythm of the field continued. A quiet pattern of movement and pause, lift and place, the sounds blending together into something steady, almost ordinary, and it was that ordinariness that felt the most unfamiliar. Time passed without being counted, measured only by the shift of light and the length of shadows beginning to form beneath their feet, and eventually one of the men walked toward a nearby water barrel, lifting a metal cup, filling it, then setting it down on the edge within reach, not calling anyone over, not assigning terms, just placing it there as if it had always belonged. Elsa noticed it a few moments later, the glint of sunlight on the rim, and she paused, just briefly, looking at it as if it required permission, but no one stopped her, no one watched her closely, and so she stepped toward it, slowly, each movement deliberate, and picked up the cup, feeling the coolness of the metal against her fingers. She drank carefully at first, a small sip, then another, the water plain but steady, and when she lowered the cup, she did not rush to return it, she simply set it back where it had been, within reach of the next person, an action so simple it felt unfamiliar. When she turned back toward her work, she caught sight of Jack again at the edge of the field, his posture unchanged, his presence constant but not heavy, and there was something in the distance between them that felt intentional, as if he had chosen not to stand closer, not to oversee, but to allow space to exist without interruption. Elsa bent again to her task, pressing the post into place, aligning it with the others, and as she stepped back to check her work, she noticed something small but undeniable. The line was straight, not because someone had corrected it, but because she had made it so. And that realization stayed with her longer than she expected. Behind her, the field stretched on, the others moving in that same quiet rhythm, no longer bound by anything visible, yet still connected by something that had not existed when they arrived, and as the light softened just slightly, shifting toward the afternoon, Elsa understood without fully forming the thought that what had been removed that morning was not only metal, but something else, something that did not fall to the ground, something that could not be seen, but could be felt in every step she now took without hesitation. The light began to soften as the afternoon stretched forward, not cooler yet but less sharp, the edges of everything losing their harshness, and the field settled into a quieter rhythm that no longer felt forced, just sustained. Elsa worked without counting time, without measuring effort against expectation, and the difference was subtle but steady, her movements no longer guarded, no longer shaped by what might happen next, but by what was directly in front of her, the next post, the next line. The next small correction that belonged to her hands alone. A strand of hair slipped loose across her face, and she brushed it back without thinking, a small, automatic gesture that would have felt unnecessary hours earlier, and she paused for just a moment after, recognizing it, the ease of it, the absence of caution in something so simple. Nearby, one of the women let out a quiet laugh, short and surprised, as if the sound had escaped before she could stop it, and it hung briefly in the air. Unfamiliar but not unwelcome, before fading back into the steady noise of work. No one reacted sharply, no one silenced it, and that, more than the sound itself, marked a shift that could not be undone. Elsa straightened again, pressing her hand lightly against the small of her back, and looked across the field, seeing how the lines they had been working on were beginning to take shape, straight and aligned, not perfect, but consistent, built from a series of small decisions rather than strict commands. She noticed the way the others moved now, less rigid, less synchronized in the old sense, but more natural, each person adjusting in their own way, and yet the work continued forward without interruption. The water cup passed quietly from one hand to another, no longer a question, just part of the rhythm, and when it reached her again, she took a longer drink this time, not rushed, not measured, just enough to feel the coolness settle and stay. In the distance, a few clouds had begun to gather, thin and slow, casting faint shadows that moved across the ground like something drifting just out of reach, and Elsa followed one with her eyes for a second before returning to her task, grounding herself again in what was real and close. Jack remained near the edge of the field, but he had shifted slightly, leaning one shoulder against a fence post, his stance relaxed in a way that did not draw attention, and yet he was still present, still watching without directing, as if the absence of interference was its own kind of choice. Elsa wondered briefly what he saw when he looked at them now, if anything had changed from his perspective, or if this was simply how things were meant to be all along, and the thought did not linger long, because there was nothing in his expression that suggested judgment or expectation, only a quiet steadiness that neither demanded nor explained. The work continued, and with it came a growing sense that the field itself was no longer unfamiliar, that the wide open space no longer felt like something to be endured but something to move through, step by step, without resistance. As the sun lowered just slightly, shifting the color of the light from harsh white to something warmer, Elsa placed another post into the ground, pressing it firm, then stepping back to check the line, and for a moment she did not think about what had brought her here, or what might come after. She only saw what stood in front of her, straight, steady, built by her own hands, and she understood, not in words but in feeling, that whatever had changed that morning was not temporary, not something that would be taken back with the setting sun, but something that would remain, carried quietly in the way she now stood, the way she now moved, the way she no longer waited for permission to take the next step. The shadows grew longer across the field, stretching thin lines over the ground they had worked all afternoon, and the heat began to ease just enough to be noticed, not gone, but softer, less demanding, and with it came a quiet shift in the air that no one announced but everyone felt. Elsa pressed the last post of her row into place, her hands steady, her movements no longer hesitant, and when she stepped back to check the line, she did not look around for approval, she simply observed it herself, measuring it against something internal rather than external, and that difference stayed with her longer than the task itself. A breeze moved again, carrying the faint smell of dry grass and distant water, and for a moment she closed her eyes, not fully, just enough to register the sensation without losing her balance, and when she opened them, the field no longer felt like a place she had been brought to, but a place she was standing in by choice, even if that choice had not been hers. At the beginning, the others were finishing their sections as well, some brushing dust from their hands, others adjusting tools back into place, small gestures that spoke of completion rather than obligation, and there was no call to stop, no whistle, no command, just a natural slowing, a shared understanding that the work had reached its end for the day. One of the cowboys walked past, collecting tools without urgency, nodding once as he passed Elsa, not as a signal of authority, but as acknowledgement, brief and unspoken, and she returned the nod almost without thinking, the motion small but deliberate, something she had not expected herself to do. The water barrel stood where it had been, the cup resting on its edge, catching the last of the light, and someone refilled it without ceremony, without drawing attention, maintaining a quiet continuity that no longer needed explanation. Elsa wiped her hands against the fabric of her dress, watching as the dust lifted and settled again, and she noticed how her fingers no longer trembled, how the small, constant tension she had carried since her arrival had begun to fade into something steadier, something she could hold without effort. In the distance, the sky shifted further, the blue deepening, the edges of the clouds catching a warmer tone, and the horizon seemed closer now, not because it had moved, but because she had. Jack stepped away from the fence post at last, not approaching, not addressing anyone directly, but moving along the edge of the field as if tracing a boundary that no longer separated anything. His pace unhurried, his presence unchanged, and as he passed behind them, no one straightened suddenly, no one braced for instruction, they simply remained as they were, standing in their own space, their own balance. Elsa turned slightly as he moved past, not fully, just enough to follow his motion with her eyes, and for a brief moment their paths aligned again, not in distance but in awareness. And she understood then that whatever had happened earlier had not required repetition, it had already settled into the ground beneath them, into the way the day had unfolded without force. The field behind her held the lines they had built, quiet evidence of time spent, effort given, not demanded, and as she looked at it, she did not see labor, she saw continuity, something that would remain after they left, something that did not carry the weight of what had come before. The men began to move toward the far side, gathering what remained, and the women followed, not in formation, not in strict lines, but together, their steps unbound, their pace natural, and as Elsa walked, she noticed the sound beneath her feet again, not metal, not dragging, just the soft, steady contact of boots against earth, a sound so ordinary it had once been invisible, and now it marked every step forward, quiet, consistent, and entirely her own. They walked back without being told to, not in lines, not in formation, just in a loose rhythm that formed on its own, boots pressing into the cooling ground, each step quieter than the last as the evening settled over the ranch. The sky stretched wide above them, turning from pale blue to something deeper, streaked with soft color that lingered along the horizon, and the air carried a different weight now, no longer pressing down, but opening outward, giving space where there had been none. Before, Elsa kept her pace steady, not too fast, not too slow, aware of the distance between her and the others but no longer measuring it, no longer adjusting herself to match something imposed, and as she walked, she noticed the absence again, not just the chains, but the sound they had made, the constant reminder of limitation that had once defined every movement, now replaced by something almost imperceptible, the quiet rhythm of steps that belonged only to her. Ahead, a wooden structure came into view, simple, weathered, its lines straight but softened by time, and the men moved toward it without urgency, opening a gate that swung with a low, familiar creak, holding it open as the women approached, not counting, not directing, just allowing passage, and Elsa stepped through without hesitation, her eyes lifting briefly to take in the space beyond, the shape of the place, the way it held itself without confinement. Inside, the ground was packed firm, swept clean in a way that suggested care rather than control, and a long table stood off to one side, its surface marked by use, not pristine, but maintained, and she noticed the small details without fully focusing on them, the way a cup had been set near the edge, the way light from a window fell across the wood, steady and warm. The others moved in quietly, some pausing, some continuing forward, each choosing where to stand without being placed, and that choice, however small, carried weight. One of the cowboys crossed the room and set down a bundle of cloth, unfolding it without announcement, revealing simple items, clean, practical, and he stepped back again, leaving them there as if they had always been meant for use, not as something given, but as something available. Elsa remained near the entrance for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe, feeling the texture of the wood beneath her fingers, solid, unmoving, and she realized she was no longer waiting for instruction to step further inside. She moved then, slowly, choosing a place along the table, not because it was assigned, but because it felt right, and she stood there, looking down at the surface, at the marks left by previous use, and for the first time since arriving, she did not feel like an outsider to the space, only someone new to it. Across the room, Jack entered last, closing the gate behind him with a quiet motion, not sealing anything in, just completing the movement, and he paused briefly near the doorway, his eyes moving once across the room, taking in the arrangement, the stillness, and then he stepped aside, not to the center, not to lead, but to the edge, where he had always chosen to stand. Elsa glanced toward him without turning her head fully, and there was no signal, no expectation in his posture, only that same calm presence that had marked the beginning of the day, unchanged by what had followed. The room held a different kind of silence now, not empty, not tense, but settled, like something had found its place without needing to be forced, and as Elsa drew in a slow breath, she understood that the day had not ended with the work in the field, it had continued into this space, into the way they stood, the way they moved, the way nothing needed to be said for everything to be understood. The room held its quiet shape as the last light of the day filtered through the window, settling across the table in long, soft lines that moved slowly with the passing minutes, and no one rushed to fill the silence, because it no longer needed to be filled. Elsa rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table, feeling the grain beneath her fingertips, the small imperfections worn into the wood by time and use. And she traced one of those marks without thinking, a shallow groove that caught her attention, not for what it was, but for the fact that it existed without explanation, without instruction, simply part of the space. Nearby, one of the women unfolded a piece of cloth from the bundle that had been set out, smoothing it carefully as if the act itself required respect, and another reached for a cup, turning it in her hands before setting it down again, each movement quiet, deliberate, chosen rather than assigned. The air inside carried a faint warmth, not from the heat outside, but from something more contained, the stillness of a place that had been lived in, used, returned to, and Elsa found herself standing differently within it, her weight balanced, her shoulders no longer braced against an unseen pressure. A chair shifted softly against the floor as someone moved it slightly, the sound low, controlled, and it did not interrupt anything. It became part of the rhythm that had formed, as natural as the wind had been in the field. No one spoke loudly, in fact, no one spoke at all for several moments, and yet there was no tension in that silence, only a shared awareness that did not require words to hold it together. Elsa lifted her gaze toward the window, watching as the light outside changed, the sky deepening, the edges of the horizon softening into evening, and she realized that time had moved forward without her tracking it, without the usual markers that had once defined her days. Across the room, one of the cowboys placed a kettle near the far end of the table, the metal catching the last light, and he stepped back again, not announcing anything, not instructing anyone to gather, simply leaving it there as part of the space, an option rather than a directive. Elsa watched the gesture, small and unspoken, and understood it in the same way she had understood the tools in the field, the water cup, the open gate, each one an offering that did not demand response, only allowed it. She reached out then, slowly, and adjusted the position of the cloth in front of her, aligning it with the edge of the table, a simple act, but one that belonged entirely to her decision, and she paused after, recognizing the difference between being placed and placing something herself. Jack remained near the edge of the room, as he had outside, not drawing attention, not withdrawing either, simply present in a way that did not disturb the balance that had formed, and when his gaze moved across the space, it did not linger on any one person, it did not evaluate, it simply acknowledged. Elsa met that glance once more, briefly, and there was nothing in it that asked for anything, no expectation, no confirmation, only the same quiet steadiness that had marked the beginning of the day, and she realized that whatever had been set into motion earlier had not required repetition. It had already taken hold in the way the room now felt, in the way they stood within it. The kettle remained untouched for a moment longer, the cups still, the cloths laid out, the table holding everything without demand, and as the light dimmed further, Elsa understood that this, too, was part of the same change, not a single action, not a single moment, but a continuation, something that extended beyond the field, beyond the removal of metal, into the way time now moved, into the way space now held them, quietly, without force, and entirely differently than before. The kettle was the first thing to move, not by command, not by announcement, but by choice. As one of the women stepped forward, lifted it carefully, and began to pour, the sound of liquid meeting metal soft and steady, filling the quiet without breaking it. Elsa watched the motion, the way the steam rose in thin, wavering lines, catching what little light remained, and something about it felt familiar in a way she could not place. Not the object itself, but the act, the intention behind it. Simple, human, unguarded, the cup was set down again, not passed directly, not handed with instruction, just placed within reach, and after a moment, another hand moved, lifting it, repeating the same action, and the pattern formed on its own, one after another, without coordination, without direction, yet entirely understood. Elsa hesitated only briefly before stepping forward, her hand closing around the handle, the warmth immediate but not overwhelming, grounding in a way she had not expected, and she held it there for a second longer than necessary, feeling the weight, the steadiness of it, before bringing it closer, taking a careful sip. The taste was plain, not remarkable, but it was real, and that was enough, and when she lowered the cup, she did not rush, she did not return it immediately, she simply stood there, present in the moment, before placing it back on the table for the next person. Around her, the room had shifted again, not visibly, but in the way people occupied it, the distance between them no longer defined by caution, but by space freely chosen, and the silence that had once felt uncertain now held something steadier, something that did not need to be filled with words. One of the women spoke then, softly, a single sentence in her own language, not loud enough to carry across the room, but enough to be heard by those nearest, and no one corrected her, no one reacted sharply. The sound simply settled into the space like everything else had. Elsa turned her head slightly, listening, not for meaning, but for tone, and it was not fear, not restraint, just a voice, and that alone marked a change that did not need explanation. Jack remained near the edge, as he always had, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and when he moved, it was only to step aside as someone passed, making room without signaling it, a small adjustment that spoke more clearly than any instruction. Elsa noticed that, the way space was given rather than taken, and she found herself mirroring it without thinking, shifting slightly as another woman moved beside her, allowing the same quiet exchange to take place. The light outside had dimmed further now, the window reflecting more of the room than the sky beyond, and the boundaries between inside and outside felt less defined, as if the change that had begun in the field had carried through every space it touched. Elsa set the cup down again, her fingers releasing it without hesitation, and she looked at her hands for a moment, noticing the dust still settled in the lines of her skin, the small marks left by the day's work, and for the first time, she did not see them as signs of exhaustion, but as evidence of something she had chosen to do, something she had completed on her own terms. The room remained quiet, but not empty, filled instead with small movements, subtle exchanges, the kind that did not draw attention but built something lasting, and as Elsa lifted her gaze once more, she understood that what had begun with the removal of a single object had extended far beyond it, into the way they now stood, the way they now moved, the way even silence had changed its meaning, no longer something to endure, but something that could be shared without fear. The room grew quieter as the last of the light faded, not darker in a way that closed things in, but softer, as if the edges of everything had been gently lowered, and the small sounds that remained carried further now, the faint clink of a cup being set down, the subtle shift of fabric as someone adjusted their stance, the low exhale of breath that no longer needed to be held. Elsa stood where she had chosen, her hands resting loosely at her sides, no longer searching for something to hold on to, and she became aware of how still she could be without feeling trapped, how the absence of tension had created a different kind of awareness, one that did not demand reaction, only presence. Across the table, one of the women folded the cloth she had been using, smoothing it carefully before placing it back with the others, not instructed to do so, not required, but completing the motion as if it mattered. And Elsa watched that gesture, recognizing it for what it was, a decision made without pressure, a small act of care that belonged entirely to the person making it. The kettle had been moved slightly, repositioned closer to the center, not by any one person in particular, but by the quiet adjustments that had taken place over time, and it now sat there as part of the room rather than an object within it, something integrated rather than introduced. Jack remained near the edge, his silhouette less defined now in the dimmer light, but his presence no less steady, and when he shifted his weight, it was subtle, almost unnoticeable, as if he was careful not to disturb what had formed. Elsa found herself looking toward him again, not out of uncertainty, not seeking direction, but out of recognition, as if he had become part of the same quiet pattern that surrounded them, and when their eyes met briefly, there was nothing exchanged beyond acknowledgement, no expectation, no confirmation, just a shared understanding that did not require words. Outside, the sky had deepened into evening, the last trace of color fading into a calm, even tone, and the sounds of the ranch carried in faintly, distant, steady, part of a world that continued without interruption. One of the cowboys moved toward the door and opened it slightly, allowing the cooler air to drift in, and no one questioned the gesture, no one reacted, it simply became part of the environment. A small adjustment that changed the feel of the room without altering its balance. Elsa took a slow breath, noticing the difference, the way the air moved more freely now, and she realized that she was no longer anticipating what would happen next, no longer measuring each moment against an unknown outcome. She was simply within it, allowing it to unfold without resistance. The others began to settle into stillness as well, some leaning lightly against the table, others standing with their weight evenly distributed, and the space between them no longer carried distance, but presence, each person occupying their place without needing to define it. Elsa looked down at the table once more, at the marks, the objects, the quiet arrangement that had formed over the course of the evening, and she understood that nothing in the room had been forced into its position. Everything had arrived there through small, deliberate choices, and that realization stayed with her longer than anything that had been said or done. As the last light disappeared completely and the room held its calm, steady shape, Elsa remained where she was, not waiting, not preparing, just standing, and in that stillness, she understood something that did not need to be spoken, that what had changed earlier that day had not been a moment that passed, it had become something that stayed, carried forward in every quiet decision that followed, in every step taken without hesitation, in every space that no longer needed to be controlled to be understood. The night settled fully, not with a sudden change but with a gradual quieting of everything beyond the walls, the distant sounds of the ranch softening into a steady backdrop that no longer demanded attention, and inside, the room held its calm, unchanged by the absence of light, as if what defined it was no longer visible but understood. Elsa remained where she stood, her posture relaxed in a way that still felt new, her weight evenly placed, her hands at rest, and she noticed how her breathing had slowed into something natural, no longer measured against anything external, no longer shaped by expectation. Across the room, one of the women shifted slightly closer to the table, reaching for a cup again, not out of need but out of habit forming, and the motion was unremarkable in itself, yet it carried a quiet certainty, the kind that comes from knowing no one will stop you. Another followed, not immediately, not in response, but in her own time, and the pattern repeated. Without coordination, each action independent, yet connected in its simplicity, Elsa watched these small movements with a kind of attention she had not given before, not analyzing them, not questioning them, simply recognizing them as part of something that had taken shape without force. Jack stepped toward the door then. Not to leave, not to close it, but to adjust it slightly, the hinge moving with a soft sound as he positioned it to allow the night air to pass through more freely, and when he stepped back again, he did not return to the center, he resumed his place along the edge, as if the boundary he kept was not distance, but respect. Elsa understood that now in a way she had not earlier, that his choice to remain apart was not separation, but space given, a quiet acknowledgement that what had been set in motion did not need to be guided further. She moved then, not because she had to, but because she chose to, stepping away from the table and toward the open doorway, her steps unhurried, her gaze steady, and when she reached the threshold, she paused, looking out into the night where the outlines of the land were still visible, softened by darkness but present. The air outside felt cooler, carrying a faint trace of moisture that had not been there during the day, and she drew it in slowly, allowing it to settle, and for a moment she stood there between two spaces, neither confined nor directed, simply positioned by her own choice. Behind her, the room remained quiet, the others still within it, moving in small, unspoken ways, and ahead of her, the open land stretched into darkness, not threatening, not inviting, just existing as it was. She turned her head slightly, enough to see Jack once more without fully leaving her place, and he met her glance again, brief, steady, unchanged. And in that moment there was no difference between them in terms of position, no hierarchy, no distance defined by control, only two people aware of the same space, the same quiet, the same shift that had carried through the entire day. Elsa stepped forward then, just one step beyond the threshold, her boot pressing into the ground outside, and the sound it made was soft, unremarkable, but it belonged entirely to her. And she realized that this, more than anything else, was what remained, not the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, something that could not be taken once it had been understood, something that did not require permission to exist, something that stayed even in silence, even in stillness, carried forward in every step she would take. From that moment on, she did not go far, just a few steps into the open, enough for the ground beneath her boots to feel different, less contained, more uncertain in its width, and yet she did not hesitate, because hesitation no longer served a purpose she understood. The night air settled around her, cooler now, carrying faint sounds from a distance that did not demand attention, only presence, and she stood there for a moment, letting it pass through her without resistance, without the need to interpret it. Behind her, the doorway remained open, the soft light from inside stretching out across the ground in a narrow path that stopped just short of where she stood, and the contrast between the two spaces was not sharp, not dividing, but gradual, like something blending rather than separating. Elsa looked down briefly at her feet, at the simple contact between boot and earth, and she shifted her weight again, not to test it, not to confirm anything, but because she could, because the movement belonged entirely to her and required no adjustment beyond her own balance. A faint breeze moved across the field, brushing against her clothes, lifting the edge of her sleeve, and she let it pass without bracing against it, without preparing for anything that might follow, and in that small allowance there was something new, something that had not existed before. Inside, the quiet continued, the others moving in small, steady ways, and the space did not pull her back, did not hold her in place. It simply remained, available, unchanged by her absence or her presence. She turned her head slightly, looking out across the land where shapes had softened into outlines, where distance no longer carried detail, only form, and she realized that she was no longer trying to define what she saw, no longer measuring it against memory or expectation. She was simply observing it as it was. Jack had not followed her. He remained where he had been, just inside, his position unchanged, and that, too, carried meaning, not as a distance, but as a decision, one that allowed her to stand where she was without interference, without the weight of being watched too closely. Elsa drew in another slow breath, deeper this time, and held it for a moment before letting it go, and the act itself felt different, not controlled, not restrained. Just natural, something her body no longer questioned. She took another step forward, then another, each one quiet, each one steady, and with each movement the space around her expanded, not because it had changed, but because she had. The ground beneath her remained the same, firm, uneven in places, carrying the same texture it had held all day, but her awareness of it had shifted, no longer cautious, no longer guarded, simply present. After a few steps, she stopped again, not because she needed to, but because she chose to, and she turned slightly, enough to look back toward the doorway, toward the light, toward the room that had held the quiet transformation of the evening. Nothing there had altered in her absence, the same calm, the same steady arrangement, and she understood then that movement was no longer tied to permission, that stepping away did not require explanation, and returning would not require justification. She remained there for a moment longer, between distances, between spaces, and in that stillness she recognized something that did not need to be named, that what had been given to her that day was not an action that ended, not a moment that passed, but a condition that remained, carried forward in every step she now took, in every pause she chose, in every space she entered without waiting to be told she could. She stood there a moment longer, not because she needed to decide anything, but because there was no urgency left in her to move, and the night held her in a way that did not confine, only surrounded, wide and steady, the land stretching out beyond what she could see, and for the first time since she could remember, the space in front of her did not feel like something to fear or measure. It simply existed, and she existed within it without resistance. The air carried a faint shift in temperature, cooler now, settling against her skin, and she let it remain, not adjusting, not bracing, just allowing it to be what it was. Behind her, the soft light from the doorway remained unchanged, a quiet presence rather than a pull, and she knew without turning that the room inside had not altered, that it would be there if she stepped back, just as it had been when she left it, not as a place she was kept, but as a place she could enter. Elsa drew in one more breath, steady and full, and then she turned, not abruptly, not with hesitation, but with the same calm that had shaped every movement since the morning, and she walked back toward the doorway, her steps even, her pace unforced, crossing the narrow line of light without pause. Inside, nothing shifted to meet her, no one looked up sharply, no one marked her return. And that absence was not neglect, it was acceptance, the understanding that movement did not require acknowledgement to be real. She moved past the threshold and into the room, her presence folding back into the quiet arrangement that had formed, and she took her place not where she had stood before, but where she chose now, a few feet from the table, near enough to feel the warmth of the space, far enough to remain in her own balance. Jack remained at the edge, as he always had, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and when their eyes met one last time, it was not a moment that held meaning beyond itself, it did not mark a beginning or an end, it simply confirmed what had already been understood, that nothing more needed to be done. Elsa lowered her gaze slightly, not in avoidance, but in completion, and she looked at the floor, at the simple ground beneath her feet, and she noticed again the absence, not of something taken, but of something that no longer defined her. And the realization did not arrive as a thought, but as a quiet certainty that settled without effort. Around her, the room remained as it was, small movements continuing without disruption, the kettle, the cups, the cloths, all part of a pattern that required no direction, and she stood within it as one part among many, not separate, not confined, simply present. Outside, the night continued, unchanged by what had happened within these walls, and inside, nothing announced itself as different. Yet everything had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, not because of a single act, but because of what that act had allowed. Elsa lifted her head again, her posture steady, her breath even, and she did not look for what would come next, she did not measure the moment against what had been, she simply stood, aware, grounded, and in that stillness. The day settled into something lasting, not as memory, but as foundation, something carried forward without effort, without explanation. No one spoke, no one needed to, and the quiet that filled the space was no longer empty, it held something else now, something that could not be seen but could be felt in every step, every breath, every pause. She did not raise her voice, she did not need to, she had raised something else entirely, something that remained long after the sound of metal had disappeared, something that did not return to the ground, something that stayed.